by way of my background, I did have the pleasure. I loved my career. I loved working in the intelligence community. It helped satisfy a lot of curiosity that I had about the world and how things worked. I think maybe the other thing that's important to know is that I was not involved in partisan politics. I worked for presidents of both parties. I worked for senators of both parties. I'm a registered independent. And my interest in the field that I worked in was very simple in that regard. The question, there was only one question, that is, what is in the nation's best interest? And so it was a more simple assignment in that respect than perhaps some people who serve in other positions in government. What I decided to do after talking with Greg to want to make this as useful to you as possible and answer your questions. I did also want to provide a little background on this subject because few people really have been exposed to that, and it's very pertinent. I think some of that'll come out later. So I have a few slides to just run through a little bit of the history and background of this issue, and then I'll jump into this issue of why the US government is now taking this issue very seriously indeed. So to jump into the history, it turns out that people have been reporting things that are similar to what we call UAP for thousands of years. So this is one of the pharaohs who reported seeing a fiery disk in the sky. Actually, another pharaoh did later. If we look at the Middle Ages, it turns out that, and I don't know why this is not showing up. There we go. All over the world, for hundreds and indeed thousands of years, people have been reporting things that appear to be similar to what many people today are reporting. Of course, we don't know what they really saw, but it does certainly raise the question. My friend Dr. Jacques Vallée has written a tremendous book called Wonders in the Sky, and he documents almost 500 cases like this from around the world. This was, as you can see, Germany in 1697. You can see this object with these beams, and there was an account written up of this, and there are many others like it. The idea that we're not alone is also more ancient than probably many people realize. It's kind of stunning to think that someone in, say, 75 BC would reach the conclusion that there are in other regions of space, other worlds, other beings, and other men, given the limited knowledge they had of astronomy in those days. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for his view that other suns exist, innumerable Earths revolve around those, and living beings inhabit those worlds. Again, stunning foresight on the part of someone working with a very narrow base of information. As I say, he was burned alive. Sometimes on social media, myself and my colleagues are also subject to sort of an inferno of hatred and whatever, but so it goes when you introduce new ideas. I want to jump quickly into then the history in this country and try to bring it back to the topic. There we go. So in America, this really started to become an issue for our government in World War II. And pilots were reporting what they called Foo Fighters. And they were unexplained, luminous objects that were sometimes flying alongside fighters and bombers. This occurred in both the European theater and in the Pacific theater, but it really didn't begin to get much traction as an issue for the government until World War II. Later on, and at the point where we started to experiment with nuclear weapons. And that's when there was a real serious uptick in UFO, as they called it then, or UAP sightings, as we say today. And here's an example. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Fermi paradox. Does that ring any bells? So the famous nuclear physicist Enrico Fermi legendary story about him, and he's having lunch with some of his colleagues at Los Alamos, and they're talking about alien life in the universe and how the infinite extent of the universe and the infinite number of planets and stars and suns, and then referring to alien life in a sort of jocular manner, he says, yeah, where is everybody? Where are the aliens if they're really out there? And the irony is, this is a memo from Los Alamos, almost the same month he was making that comment. And what we see in this memo, which is directed to the Director of Special Investigations at the headquarters of the Air Force, is profound concern on the part of the Los Alamos security personnel about UFOs that are overflying this sensitive, restricted military airspace. He goes on to say in this memo, they had convened various meetings and conducted their own investigations and run out of answers. He says that the observers of these phenomenon include scientists, special agents of the Office of Special Investigations, the IG, U.S. Air Force, airline pilots, military pilots, Los Alamos security inspectors, military personnel, and many other persons of various occupations whose reliability is not questioned. And then he describes the main types that are seen, and you can see disk or variation is number 2. Fireballs were number 1. He attached to this memo over 200 individual sightings just from the Los Alamos area from 1948 to 1950. Bear in mind that most people did not report these things, these instances when they occurred, which is something that continues today. If I asked you to raise your hand, how many people here have seen a UAP or a UFO? Okay, so we've got a handful. And how many of you reported it to MUFON or another organization? 1. So that's a pretty typical ratio. We have maybe 1 of 6 people. So the actual number of sightings is almost invariably far, far higher than the number of sightings that we actually have a record of. That was certainly the case here. So, it's striking irony that Fermi is saying, where is everybody? And meanwhile, flying saucers are flying all over and around Los Alamos. And that kind of dichotomy is something that you see going forward with this issue through time. So I think maybe I need to point this something else to get it to change more.
This might be another example.
More quickly. There we go. So also around that same time, in nearby Farmington, New Mexico, and here are some of the accounts of that in local papers, there were over 100 flying saucers reported in a single day in this small town near Los Alamos. This is the kind of activity that was going on that people generally have no idea how prolific this phenomenon has been and for how long here in the United States. Around that same time, a couple of years later, we had on 2 successive weekends in Washington, D.C., overflights of the nation's capital of UFOs. Fighters were scrambled, the radar operators saw them, there were personnel on the ground who saw them, and this created a almost national panic, and it led to the largest press conference since World War II, led by the head of Air Force Intelligence. And the Air Force was keen to try to placate the public and reassure them there was nothing to be concerned about. And their explanation was radar inversion. And yet the pilots who were in the air that day were seeing these objects. Radar control tower personnel were seeing them on the radar and visually. And this happened on 2 successive weekends. One of the interesting things about this is a colleague of mine who is also a volunteer for Harvard's Galileo project, which is developing sensors to deploy so that we can start to get civilian scientific data and not have to rely on the government, which for the most part has classified the data on this topic. She has gone back and pulled data from different telescopes around the nation that were doing surveys of the night sky. And lo and behold, she found unexplained stars and lights at a period in 1952 before there were any satellites, any man-made satellites in orbit. And she's written some peer-reviewed scientific papers on that. And interestingly, the instances that she found were July 1952, the same month that this was happening in Washington. Let's see here. There were hundreds and hundreds of sightings, and the government was getting very agitated at this point, and so was the public. Not something you learn about at school, but the government felt it had to respond. In 1953, there was a secret panel convened by the CIA to evaluate this topic, and there was a concern on the part of the government and the CIA that the Soviet Union might exploit this issue from a security standpoint, that it might lead to flooding our air defense networks with false information, that it might produce paralysis or terrify the population, other sorts of things. So they made a deliberate policy-making decision to try to discredit this entire topic, and began to enlist Walt Disney Corporation and others, and talk to journalists, and take other steps to try to really diminish any interest, credibility, legitimacy around this topic. Meanwhile, the Air Force began to undertake a number of studies. This was Project Blue Book, and they looked at 12,000 UFO reports. Now, Project Blue Book, very controversial. Even insiders, people part of the project, saw it as largely a public relations effort. The chief scientist for the project was a gentleman named Dr. Alan Hynek, a professional astronomer, and he wrote a book subsequently about how flawed the Air Force process was in this review. But one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up, and one of the reasons it's pertinent today, is because when they did this review, they binned these 12,000 sightings into 4 categories based on the quality of the evidence. So poor, doubtful, good, and excellent. And what the Air Force and the government were trying to suggest to people was, well, we explained most of these, and if we just had better data, we could probably explain them all. They're probably just conventional aircraft and things that people are misperceiving. But when you look at the data, what you find is the reverse. The excellent cases, of which there were 213 with multiple witnesses, often government personnel, were the ones they were least able to explain. The more witnesses and the more data they had, radar data, other kinds of sensor data, the more difficult it was to find a conventional explanation for many of these cases. Ultimately, this led the Air Force to request a report that was conducted at the University of Colorado by a scientist named James Condon, who from the outset made it clear that he didn't attach any credibility to the subject, and even said publicly at one point, you know, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but we're going to find that there's nothing to this phenomenon. And once that report was issued, the Air Force said, well, we don't need to look at this anymore. So they stepped away in 1969. The ball was picked up then by civilian research organizations. And the data that they have, so there are 2 primary civilian research organizations, the Mutual UFO Network and the National UFO Reporting Center. And between them, we are now they have now collected nearly 500,000 reports, which we know from our sample here is indicative of the fact there are probably maybe a couple million actual reports during that period of time. A former NASA scientist, Dr. Richard Haynes, has focused on sightings by commercial airline pilots, and he's documented over 3,000 cases. And now that the stigma is lifting around this topic, you may have noticed in the papers more frequent accounts from these commercial airline pilots. It's starting to be something they can talk about publicly. and not fear loss of their jobs as was once the case. I should also mention that, another pattern here is no coincidence perhaps that I have an intelligence background. From the very beginning, the people who tried to raise public interest in this and suggest that there really is something to this, and tried to bring some more of this public have been intelligence personnel. So the very first organization, public organization, was called the National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. The first CIA director was one of the members of the board of directors. Admiral Farney, who led the Navy Guided Missile Program, was on the board of directors. A Marine Corps colonel named Kehoe was on the board of directors. It was mostly former government military intelligence personnel, and that pattern also continues to this day. My colleagues have mostly been intelligence personnel, and you'll see why in the connection, because we were exposed to data that just is not generally available, and for some of us, we felt it was important for various reasons for that information to become public. Let's see, here we go. So how did this really transition from being an issue that was regarded with derision and disdain, and still is to a significant degree, particularly in the academic community? We can talk about that further, to the point where today we have an official government organization that studies this. Our government acknowledges this is real. The individual leading that office, who's a scientist, a distinguished scientist, acknowledges publicly there are cases of vehicles, craft, doing things that we do not understand. We don't know how the things they're doing are possible or feasible. So the US government has made a very sudden turn beginning in 2017, which I will explain here as we go forward on this issue. And your government today acknowledges and admits this is real and it's happening. There is an issue with how much detail about that they're actually sharing. I can tell you I'm still involved with this on the government side as well as on the public side, working to some degree with Congress and the executive branch and law enforcement. And there is a lot more information that they're often not able to share because in some cases it would compromise sensitive sources. In other cases, simply because of the bureaucracy. And I'll give you some examples of things that have gotten into the public domain, which the government has many more examples of, which they haven't released and should release, and probably it's not even legal what they're doing right now, sitting on some of that data. An issue that I continue to try to draw attention to. So here's what happened and how I got involved in this in a more public way and why it is today that your government takes this subject so seriously. In 2017, I had a lifelong curiosity and interest in this topic, and a friend of mine at CIA, knowing of that, introduced me to an individual in the Pentagon who he knew was working on this issue. And my CIA friend had had a personal experience which caused him to become very interested in this after a life, after being a former skeptic. And I was at the time an unpaid consultant of the Office of Naval Intelligence, so I still had my security clearances and began to attend meetings with this gentleman. And one of the first cases I learned about was something we called the Nimitz case, and reference to the USS, the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. And in brief, this is what happened. So November 2004, the Carrier Strike Group is operating off the coast of Southern California, and they're doing a workup, and air protection is provided by the USS Princeton for that formation. They have an Aegis radar, the most advanced naval radar in the world, and they begin seeing these objects dropping down essentially from space. And they begin to pick them up on this advanced radar at about 60 to 80,000 feet. And they're seeing these things in significant numbers of them dropping vertically, right? So nothing that we make drops vertically from space. It always comes in on a glide path or following a parabolic curve. So they're thinking there must be something wrong with this advanced new radar. So they rebooted it. The radar technicians, I've interviewed all these people, and they still continue to see this. And they see them dropping down and then hovering, and then they're moving horizontally. And so after a couple of days of this, they see one of these objects coming up the coast of California at a time when there are some F-18s nearby in the air doing training. So with the captain gives permission, they direct those two F-18s to an intercept. An F-18 has two naval aviators on board, a pilot and a weapons systems operator in the backseat. They are told this is a real-world mission. They don't know what it is. They think maybe it's drug smugglers or something. So they are vectored to this intercept point, and when they arrive, there is a white object, 50 feet long roughly, no wings, no control surfaces of any kind, and it's moving in a sort of jagged manner, almost like a ping pong ball might if you shook it in a box. Very, very strange. And the water underneath, the ocean surface underneath this craft is foamy and roiling. And their first thought is maybe an airplane went down and this is a search and rescue mission, maybe something crashed. These two F-18s, one of them is commanded by the squadron commander, Dave Fravor. So he's the most senior officer in the squadron, one of the most senior officers on the carrier, combat veteran. He dives down to intercept this thing to get a close look at it. His wingman stays high, and I've interviewed the pilots and the weapons systems operators as well back then, and still am in touch with them. And as he approaches this thing, it becomes aware of his presence, and it turns around and faces his aircraft. And then as he's trying to circle in, it begins to circle away from him. And Dave tries to cut the corner, tries to cut across the middle of this to get closer, and it takes off literally almost like a bullet. And he could just barely see it sort of disappear like that. Fortunately, the Princeton was still able to track it. So they're getting low on fuel. They start to head back to the Nimitz, and they get they're contacted by the Nimitz, and Commander Fravor is told, "You're not going to believe this, Commander. That thing's at your cap point." So that bizarre white craft travels 60 miles in about 2 or 3 seconds, and it went precisely to the lat long that they had programmed in their computers that day for their rendezvous for their exercise away from the carrier. Well, they couldn't pursue it any further. They were low on fuel, so they land. Another F-18 goes up, and that F-18 also approached it and gets a video, an infrared video of this thing. Meanwhile, there was another airplane aloft, which is a Navy version of an AWACS aircraft, and they had gun radar. The conditions that day were conditions of perfect visibility, sunshine, cumulus clouds. So now we have 6 naval aviators, the world's most advanced radar, and infrared videotape data that is all corroborating, all mutually reinforcing, all consistent. And when I heard about this, I just was kind of thunderstruck. Well, meanwhile, we're getting reports from the other coast. So this was back in 2004. And by the way, this is the second F-18 that went up, it was actually the third F-18 that went up, was captained by Chad Underwood. And these are his words. It was just behaving in ways that aren't physically normal. That's what caught my eye, because aircraft, whether they're manned or unmanned, still have to obey the laws of physics. They have to have some source of lift, some source of propulsion. The Tic Tac, as they called it, because of its shape and its color, was not doing that. It was going from like 50,000 feet to 100 feet in like seconds, which is simply not possible. And Commander Fravor had the same sort of reaction. When he saw this thing, he later said and testified under oath before Congress about this, and said, his personal view was it was not from this world. He also said, "I'd like to fly that thing." Typical Navy fighter jack, right? So,
may I interrupt just to ask?
Yeah, of course.
When he said it's just not possible, you mean given the laws of gravity, given the laws of
Given
physics,
our present
given what we
understanding.
knew about propulsion and
Right,
navigation
and
and so forth.
so great question. Let me add to that. It wasn't just the speed and the propulsion, so there was no sonic boom. How is that possible? How does something not create a sonic boom when it achieves hypersonic speeds like that? There was no plasma. There was no evidence of friction. The object remained cool on the exterior because the camera that they took the video with is an infrared camera. And you can see, you would expect the exterior of this craft to be smoking, burning hot from that kind of speed. Also, it survived. So fighter aircraft built by the United States can withstand G-forces, maybe 15G, 25G. The engineers that have calculated the G-forces involved from that degree of acceleration, it's something like 1,000-fold greater than anything built by man could possibly withstand. So we just have our own scientists and my friends at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works and so forth. They have no idea. Well, there's a theory, but it's just a theory as to how this might be accomplished. And if you ask them to build something like this, so my friend Steve Justice at Lockheed Martin said, well, we could build something that would do one of those things, maybe. Maybe we could build something that wouldn't create a sonic boom, or maybe we could be something where we disguise the friction of the plasma to do all those things. Not a chance. And so it just leaves our best people stumped as to how this is feasible. And this is why the extraterrestrial hypothesis comes into play, because people struggle to come up with a hypothesis that works, an alternative hypothesis to explain this. We know it's not ours. We're quite certain that it isn't Russian or Chinese. We certainly hope not. And the fact that, as I pointed out with the historical data, this kind of thing has been going on for so long really underscores that fact. If it was Russian or Chinese, one, that would be mind-boggling, and it would be a huge intelligence failure. Not that we haven't had intelligence failures, but who was doing this 30, 40, 50 years ago and had those capabilities? Nobody thinks that we or the Russians or Chinese could have been doing that at that point in time. So these are some of the observables, as we call them, that these craft have demonstrated on over and over again. As I said, at the time, I was also finding out that, by the way, we don't need to play this in the interest of time. This is, if you want to see it later, I can play that video that the F-18, the third F-18 took. But while this was going on, we also had reports coming in from the other coast, and they were much more current reports, and I was seeing these reports coming from the carrier strike groups that were operating off the East Coast. And if I can get this to move forward, there we go. So this will provide an example of what was being reported in 2015. Now, when I'm having these meetings, it's 2017, and this kind of activity is still going on, and it's still going on in a significant way. And it's not just like tic-tac kinds of vehicles. So they're beginning to see almost every time they go to the range. So this is restricted military airspace. Nobody else is supposed to be there. These things don't have transponders. Nobody knows where they're coming from. And one of the things they're starting to encounter almost every time they go out there, and it's starting to create a flight hazard, and they're starting to post signs in the locker rooms of the flight squadron saying, beware of the potential for mid-air collisions with these things. They're starting to see spheres that are 6 feet across that have a cube, a dark cube inside. And these things seem to be, they're present when they go out and when they come back. They seem to have unlimited loiter time. They have, again, no means of propulsion that we can discern. There's no air intake, there's no exhaust, there's no control surfaces, there's no wings. Sometimes they're flying in formation. Sometimes they're going at supersonic speeds. How do you get a sphere with a cube inside to fly at supersonic speeds? And how do you embed intelligence in it so that it can react to U.S. Navy fighter aircraft and stay abreast of them and so forth. So this is the kind of thing that, again, I'm hearing this in the Pentagon, and nobody's reporting this. So the Secretary of Defense doesn't know this is happening. Congress doesn't know this is happening. The American people certainly don't know this is happening. And the reason is because everybody, it's a social phenomenon. Everybody is afraid of being criticized, they're afraid of being mocked, and perhaps more importantly, they're afraid of the impact on promotions. And in fact, Air Force pilots, at least the Navy guys, are talking about it. In fact, there was a near mid-air collision. I've seen the video from that, and that led to a formal safety report being filed. Air Force F-22s use the same range, and they have much more sophisticated advanced sensors than the F-18s, and none of them were reporting any of this stuff. And we believe now that they were certainly seeing it, but there was a very strong cultural bias in the Air Force against this, and promotions are extremely competitive. And so what I was seeing was something that was deeply concerning, and it reminded me a little bit of Pearl Harbor, where we had information, in that case radar of approaching aircraft, and nobody acted on it. I was in the Senate when, I was in the Pentagon on 9/11 when the plane hit, but I was also in the Senate later when we did the after-action report and evaluated what happened and why we failed to be able to thwart that plot in advance. And as many of you probably know, CIA and FBI had information they weren't sharing. And I was seeing all these things going on. Different organizations and different services, intelligence agencies had information on this. They weren't sharing it. We didn't know who it was from, if it could be an adversary. And it was, the system was paralyzed. And we spend, at this point, about $100 billion per year, in part to provide, just for intelligence, provide warning of potential threats and security for our aerospace and so forth. And now, when somebody shows up, and it's certainly a counterintelligence threat, because whoever is watching these exercises is seeing how we fight. They're seeing how what systems we would use in combat, what frequencies we communicate on, sometimes what we call wartime reserve modes, and lots of other sensitive information that we don't want the Russians and Chinese and other people to have. So this was raising all kinds of problems in my mind. And so my natural instinct, being trying to be a good trooper, was to go through the system. And so myself and Lou Elizondo, I knew General Mattis was the Secretary of Defense at that time. I knew his special assistant, and I knew the White House liaison to General Mattis, President Trump's White House liaison. So I approached them both. I introduced them to Lou. We brought in Navy pilots, not to General Mattis, but to his assistants. And again, the stigma was so great, nobody would touch it. Nobody would do anything. So at that point, we were faced with a sort of difficult choice. Do we just ignore this like everybody else is, or do we break the glass on the fire alarm and go public? And I had, as a result of working with the Armed Services Committee and being a staff director where you're the only person who's allowed to talk to the press, I had good Hill connections. I had worked on legislation that did require the Defense Department to change its policies. I knew how that could be done. And I had these press connections, and so I saw how we might be able to get this issue in front of the American people, in front of Congress. I wasn't confident that we could succeed, but I was willing to give it a try. What made that feasible was the fact that somebody smuggled some of these authentic DoD UAP videos out of the building, met me in the parking lot. So then I had something to take to the editors of the New York Times and Washington Post and Politico, and I tried to get them competing for the story to put that out there. This is one of those videos, and let's see if we can get this to play. This was from 2015 off the coast of the Carolinas, and this object was flying in formation with 7 of those smaller round objects that I spoke about. So this thing was flying. Nobody knew what it was. There was a V-shaped formation of these spherical balls flying in formation behind it. When the Navy jets showed up, those all dispersed and went away, and they sent this little snippet back to the Pentagon to say, what the hell is going on? This is the kind of stuff we're seeing out here. Trying to get the attention of people.
Dude, there's a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not. That is the LNS, dude. Well, if there's look at this thing. It's rotating.
Are we above clouds there? Is that what we see in the southwest
Yeah,
corner?
so this is about 20,000 feet, and you're seeing this the way the pilots and the weapon systems operators see it, and this is a targeting pod. So when they're going to, they can use this to put a laser on a target and fire a missile or weapon system. They've got a range with this of many, many miles. I will say that efforts to debunk this, the U.S. government, there's a guy named Mick West on the internet who likes to propose alternative explanations for these kinds of things. And he's tried to suggest that this was actually a jet, some kind of an errant jet that didn't have its transponder on, that was 20 miles away, that was making a turn, and these Navy pilots didn't know what they were looking at. The U.S. government doesn't buy that explanation. It doesn't make sense when you actually look closely at it. This object was about 4 to 6 miles away, and they have multiple sensor feeds that tell them the distance. Obviously, if these guys couldn't, figure out something as simple and basic as how far they are from an enemy aircraft, they couldn't very well survive in combat or perform their missions. But that's the kind of thing that people who want to minimize this issue like to grab on to those kinds of proposed explanations. But I can tell you from the latest congressional hearing on this that explanation is not supported by intelligence community analysis or DoD analysis. We succeeded in getting the story to run on December 16th, 2017. And I thought, hey, my job is done. This is great. Congress is going to be floored. They're going to say, what the heck? And they also broke the story that there had been a secret UFO research program in the Pentagon. That was a little bit misconstrued. There was some money that Senator Reid, Harry Reid of Nevada, and some of his colleagues, including John Glenn and including Ted Stevens of Alaska, had earmarked to study UAP, but it went to a contractor. And it was essentially an unclassified study and did not have the support or involvement of the Air Force or the intelligence community generally. So they did the best they could with what they had. They didn't get the kind of support that I'm sure Senator Reid expected and that they had hoped from other organizations in the building. So at that point, I contacted my friends on the Armed Services Intelligence Committees, asked them, I said, I know this sounds crazy, but please listen to what these guys have to say. We brought then the Navy pilots in, and that's what really worked. Those were the guys that had the credibility. So when the Navy pilots came in and ran through their experiences and talked the senators through this, and they began to see some of the other evidence, and of course they're also then able to get some of the classified information that complements, reinforces, expands on some of this. There are lots of other videos. So, for example, this is one of numerous F-18 cockpit at-flare videos. I've seen some of the others. And why they're not released to the public, so I was investigated for having released these, and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations confirmed this was unclassified, didn't compromise national security. I would argue that it advanced national security because it made us aware of a potential threat that wasn't being addressed so that we could begin working to close that vulnerability. And yet, they have, I don't know at this point, how many dozens like this that they still haven't released. So the executive order on classification says, when in doubt, you should make it unclassified. And I can't imagine what lawful basis they have for classifying that after they publicly acknowledged that this did not damage national security. And that's a small example of a larger issue. So the new CIA director, when he was director of national intelligence, acknowledged on CNN that we have satellite imagery of UAP. And I've seen some of that as well. And some of that is even more compelling, perhaps. These infrared videos tend to be fuzzy. One of these interesting, notice there's kind of like a halo around this object. And the theory that some scientists in the community have to try to explain this method of propulsion that we're seeing is that space-time is being manipulated. Space-time itself is being manipulated in the immediate vicinity of the craft. And therefore, the craft is not feeling any acceleration. And therefore, of course, it's not getting hot. And it would explain a range of things that we're seeing if it's indeed possible. Theoretically, there's something called an Alcubierre drive, which the physics community is still refining, but it does demonstrate if you had sufficient energy, it would be possible to do that. It's way beyond the bounds of anything we could recreate at this time. It's truly, theoretical physics. But there are some theories about how this might be done if you had a much more advanced civilization with more advanced understanding of science. It also explains why it's hard to get clear, crisp pictures, because if there is an area in the immediate vicinity of the craft where space-time is distorted, then the signals from radar and so forth, or photons that are entering that field and being emanated from it, may change. It may change the rate, the frequency, and that kind of thing. So this is speculative, but some of the attempts that are being made as some of our scientists are scratching their heads and trying to figure out how this might be done, those are some of the ideas they're kicking around.
I've got about 20 questions in less than 20
Yeah,
minutes.
this is about, I'm going to near the end here.
So here's what I want to ask you first. You made reference, and let's run through them real fast. Okay?
Sure.
You referred back in the 1950s to flying saucers, but we have much more imagery since the 1950s. What are the various visual characteristics of UAPs?
Right, so this is really interesting because there's sort of certain families that we see consistently. So for example, there are triangular craft. And I just happen to have a slide here. Oh, there it goes. So this was reported by a Navy officer stationed in Hampton Roads, Virginia. And he contacted me through LinkedIn, and he wanted to know how to get this information to this new, at this time there was a task force on UAP that had just been established, and he wanted to know how to get this information to them. And he was driving with his sunroof open, and he looked up and he saw this thing flying over his car. And it was moving slightly faster, but not much faster than his car. So he got a really good look at it for a period of several minutes. And he did this very detailed sketch. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that people all over the world report almost exactly the same thing, and they have been since at least the 60s, probably the 50s. Almost always a light in each corner, almost always black, almost always at night, almost always light in the center, almost always soundless and low and slow. And let's see here, so here's an article from 1960, and you can see this report that made the newspapers, and you can see how closely this object resembles the object that this Navy officer reported in 2017, half a century later. And in fact, there were many other reports of this kind, and there's a considerable amount of raw data on this in terms of letters, hand-drawn sketches from that period. So triangles, lately, a new phenomenon, I want to talk about the drones a little bit, but triangles, orbs, like balls of light, we don't see this so much anymore, but fireballs, the occasional these white tic-tac craft, And nobody knows if they have a common source or different sources. And their behaviors are somewhat different. Sometimes they're like in the Phoenix Lights, they're more of a boomerang shaped thing.
In your opinion, when there are credible UAP sightings, is there an inarguable corollary with extraterrestrial beings? Even, I'll ask, at the controls.
My first thought about that, my inclination has always been to think that if there is an extraterrestrial connection, it's probably some kind of AI. It's probably not biological. We can see the trajectory of where our own technology is going. We already have craft that have left the solar system, Voyager 2, or Voyager 1. We can see where this is going with AI right now very clearly if you just map that out. And so that is my first inclination, to think it would be something unmanned, somebody else's space program. Not surprising that somebody else might discover us before we discovered them. But there's some information circulating that suggests that it might not be that simple. That might not be the case.
I saw you say in a documentary that you consider the solid credibility of many sightings of UAPs to be the greatest, and this is your quote, the greatest human discovery in history. So two-part question, why? And number two, what are the implications, negative and positive?
Right, so I think I wouldn't describe where we're at now as the greatest discovery in world history. If we confirm that some of these do have an extraterrestrial connection, that will be obviously a new Copernican moment. And that will be enormously disruptive to our worldview. And it will have manifest consequences, positive and negative. I do think, interestingly, Ronald Reagan actually spoke about this, and I tend to share his view. He addressed this at the United Nations, strangely, I'll come back to this and talk about the drones, because again, I think it's important to understand a little bit better what the trend has been, because we've been seeing a lot of very strange things. There it is. So in I believe it was 85, and some people think he made his statement. Now, of course, Ronald Reagan was one of two presidents who had seen a UFO himself. And he was on a campaign flight with his campaign staff, with his private pilot, and they saw this light, and he, I think typical of his character, told the pilot to follow it, to get close to it. He wanted to see what this thing was. And so they started pursuing it, and as they started to get closer, it just went straight up and disappeared. So he had exposure, as Jimmy Carter did, to this issue, and some interest in the topic. Some people think he'd gotten some classified briefings and knew a lot more, but he raised this issue, and he thought it could help us to recognize a common bond among societies. And I think indeed it could have. That would be the positive aspect of this, that it would reframe international security relations in potentially a way that mitigated a lot of the hostility between us and rival powers, and compelled us to collaborate. I think it's hopeful that when the space program began, it was kicked off by Sputnik, and that was fear of the Russians, and it was a national security issue. But as it progressed, it became a collaborative project, and we started, going to space with the Russians. So the positive side would be that. The negative side would be short-term, potentially. So much of it depends on how this comes about. So, if it's in, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, everybody panics, it's horrible, If it's something that's sort of gradual and benign, and people start to realize, and this is why I wanted to bring up the history part, if this becomes more prominent and more credible publicly, and people realize this has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, it's not potentially as disturbing and frightening.
Let's talk about that swarm of objects that appeared for weeks over the skies of the East Coast, especially New Jersey. When you first, you're all familiar with that. It was in, October into November, I think. What did you think about when you first saw those news reports?
Great setup, great lead-in. So what I thought about were these incidents, and I've written about these incidents. Very, very interesting. Didn't make the national press. Very few people know about this. So in 2017, 2018, drones, these brightly lit little craft, flew over our air base at Guam and went right to the most sensitive part of the base and started shining lights down on it and photographing it. And then a couple of years, then also this started to happen at some of our nuclear power plants. Then in 2019, we had multiple instances of US Navy warships off the coast of Southern California, and these drone-like objects were following them for hours at sea. And our anti-UAV systems were not effective against them, trying to jam the signals. This happened even in foggy weather. We had one instance where one of these things flew up in front of the bridge and shone a bright light right in on the captain and the senior crew commanding the vessel. They clearly wanted our attention. This was not being discreet like what we've seen in the past. It's a different kind of feel. Then in Colorado, very strange series of events over several months where farmers and ranchers were reporting large numbers of drones, and federal, state, local authorities were all involved in investigating this. Once again, no idea. The Navy, even with these advanced radars and even with their best efforts, could not find where these things were coming from and still doesn't know. And this was going on in Colorado, and I spoke with a sheriff out there who had responded to some of these calls, and a deputy sheriff, very interesting. He said one of the calls they responded to, there were maybe 30 or 40 of these things, and then a larger light came into the picture, and the smaller ones went inside the larger one, and the larger one took off faster than anything he's ever seen. It flew practically right over his head. And that's also documented. You can find this online officially. Not his report, but other reports from other security personnel who were investigating that. And I said, well, did you guys, what did you do to try to find who the controllers were? Because you have a limited range on controlling UAP. He said, we stopped vans, we stopped trucks. We never found anybody, couldn't implicate or identify anybody associated with this.
But
there's one more that I got to tell you about. This is important because this is part of the reason there's so much agitation in DC. And many of you may be aware of this, but not this December, a year ago December, the Air Combat Command in Langley, Virginia, had an ongoing series of drone intrusions that effectively disabled the base. They were not able to fly safely. They moved aircraft to the Naval Air Station Oceana, and they brought in special aircraft. They flew fighter patrols. And even though this was going on for weeks, they could not identify where these things were coming from, who controlled them. Some of them were unusual in terms of their size and so forth. So when New Jersey happened, to answer your question, all of these things were what sprang to mind. To me, it was a continuation of a pattern and concern. Mostly, I think it was people just seeing aircraft and helicopters and misidentifying it. It turns out when you look at that, it may not fit this mold. But we do have this very strange new pattern. This is not something that we used to see.
Skeptics are going to say, well, drones today, modern drones, are in the hands of everything from armies to farmers to tourists. And that they can do a 180 on a dime. They can go from 0 to 60 in a flash. So why couldn't that explain everything? That's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, so there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, it's astonishing what they're doing with these drones these days. However, they're not attaining the kinds of velocities and acceleration that we're seeing. A lot of those things we would not call anomalous. They don't fit the UAP pattern. They're some kind of drone, and they're often most likely probably Chinese or Russian or something else. I would say in the case of Guam, my first suspect would be the Chinese. Chinese were very upset when we put the THAAD missile battery in South Korea and made it a huge diplomatic issue, and then lo and behold, these things show up at Guam, and they're going right to the THAAD missile battery. So it's a different category, but it sort of is in a borderline area because, like the sheriff reported, those kinds of things are harder to understand and explain. And the drones that were around the Navy ships, it's hard for us to understand. This is happening in fog at night for hours. There's only a few other ships around within miles, hundreds of miles. And so where are these things coming from and who's controlling them? It's it's something we're still trying to figure out.
Okay, one quick question before we go to questions from the audience. I might still interject one or two. Why the name change from UFO to UAP? Was it just because UFOs were the stuff of science fiction?
It was partly to get rid of the baggage, right? So the UFO term, immediately people think of extraterrestrials and little green men and all that sort of thing. It was part an effort to be more agnostic and to be more empirical and get rid of that. And it was also because, in part, the Congress, when they started to ask for information, originally it went from UFOs to unidentified aerial phenomenon. So I convinced my colleagues in 2020 in the Intelligence Committee to ask for a report on UAP from the services. And DOD, when it came back, the Air Force said, well, we don't have anything. We don't. And when they were being poked on that a little bit, they said, well, you know, for example, in space, you said unidentified aerial phenomena. So we don't have to tell you about space. And the Navy doesn't have to tell us about anomalies in the ocean and so forth. So Congress wanted to make it clear, any kind of advanced vehicle you see anywhere that really suggests it might represent a breakthrough in technology that we don't have, that we need to be concerned about, we want to make sure you're responding to that.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to take questions here.
Do you believe David Grush? If so, why? If not, why not?
Thank you for the question. I know Dave well. I've known him for years. And before he went public with this, I'd actually given a talk like this with Dave at my side in front of a group in Pennsylvania. Dave is sincere and he's credible. But Dave does not have firsthand information and access. So he has not seen or touched an alien craft in the possession of the US government. He's representing what he understands based on the work that he did in the intelligence community, people he knew, people he knows, and that sort of thing. So I know Dave is sincere. I know Dave's credible. That doesn't mean that he's necessarily correct. And his information obviously is not definitive because it's secondhand. But since you're touching on that subject, I think I should probably go a little further and say that there are people that I know in the government who claim to have had direct access who are credible. And I actually, well, I have a little bit of information I can share on that. So Dave is by no means alone in that regard. I have a memo here that it was up here a second ago. Basically, back in around 2019, here it is, to my shock and surprise, I was communicating with a government official on Signal. And so, you know, for reasons of discretion. And this individual was highly placed and had access to lots of information. And I was floored. He knew of my interest, that I was involved, obviously, in working with Congress on this. And he sends me a message and he says, the Senate Armed Services Intelligence Committee would be slack-jawed if they found out what we now know. Right now, we haven't gone that far back. We're dealing with recovered UAP that landed, not crashed, landed in Kingman, Arizona in the 50s. We're vacuuming up info, and then I deleted the name, gets read in. We now know the management structure and security control systems and ownership of what they call CR, the Crash Retrieval Program. We also know who recovers landed or crashed UAPs and under what authorities. We also know that a still highly classified memo by the Secretary of the Air Force in the 50s is still in effect to maintain the cover on UAPs. We also know the SES-2, who's the Air Force gatekeeper. And I provided that name to the people that are investigating this issue in Congress and the executive branch.
Next hand.
And that is only one of multiple sources that people I know personally and not necessarily the best.
All right, from our online audience, do you believe that they have aliens in Area 51? Will they declassify it to show to the public? And what are the ramifications if they do or they do not release it?
Right. So this gets back to a bit what we've just been talking about. When I was at Area 51, I did not see any aliens. And I didn't.
Interruption. Explain very briefly what Area 51 is.
So that is our largest, most secretive test range, and it's area. So there's an area in Nevada that's probably about the size of Rhode Island. It actually has multiple ranges with contiguous boundaries. So the National Nuclear Test Site, which is very tightly guarded to this day, which I've also had the pleasure of visiting. It sits next to Area 51, which sits next to Nellis, and then there's the Tonopah Range up here. And so that whole area, it creates a very large area in a very desolate part of the United States where the US government conducts many of its most sensitive aerospace tests and so forth. That's where our stealth aircraft were originally tested at night, out of sight, very, very secure. Yeah, I can't, all I can say is, I guess, that what my position on this publicly has been that there's enough smoke, there's enough credible reporting that it's legitimate, and Congress has legitimate reason to investigate that question. There are enough credible people, not just Dave and not just this other fellow, and there's quite a few people now that have provided information behind closed doors to members of Congress or to the people investigating this, that it's as crazy as it sounds. I think it's a legitimate issue, and I don't take a position on whether it's true or not. I just say I think it's worth investigating, and if it were to be, I don't think that our government is going to come out anytime soon and say, oh yeah, something. So if you're the president of the United States, or any politician, you're not going to want to hold a press conference and say, aliens are here, but we don't know where they're from, and we can't protect you from them. Have a nice day, right? There goes your whole agenda, and it's going to take over everything, and it's going to cause a lot of sleepless nights for a lot of children and others, and so I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think to the extent that it's true, there would be a very gradual kind of rollout. And it's funny, it's ironic to me being this mix, because Americans love alien stuff when it's fictional. The top grossing movies of all time are alien stuff, it's Star Wars and Star Trek and
E.T.
E.T. and whether it's dark like Aliens or whether it's fun like E.T., these are huge themes, and I think maybe part of the reason is because people are processing this in the back of their minds, and people are, after the space program started, is when a lot of these alien movies in the 50s started taking off, because people do have anxiety about this, and it may be subconscious, unconscious, but I think it is on people's minds, but it's not something most people really want to confront, is my experience, and it is hard to process, and it does challenge our day-to-day understanding of reality.
Chris, you used the phrase just a couple of minutes ago, crazy as it sounds.
Yeah.
Let me play on that. You wrote the foreword for a book written by Luis Elizondo, who worked with you at the Pentagon, very senior Pentagon intelligence official. And the book is called Imminent. As a matter of fact, the bookworm has it for sale at the back of the chapel after this, and you've signed some of them, haven't you?
Well, maybe
you'll sign them then.
I did sign one, but I'm happy to sign one.
He wrote the foreword. But here's the point. He tells the story, crazy as it sounds, of green orbs coming to his home off and on for 7 years, passing through walls. His wife saw them, his daughters saw them, neighbors saw them. But I'm going to repeat the phrase, crazy as it sounds. So I'll put the question this way. Let's say you'd never gotten into this business. You'd gone into economics, which you majored in college, and somebody told you that story. What would you think?
Yeah, I'd be skeptical. I'd be highly skeptical. And I think it's appropriate for people to be skeptical. And I think a scientific perspective is very appropriate. And I try to maintain that perspective. And that's why I don't leap to conclusions and say the aliens are here. I don't have a better explanation for the tic tac, is the problem. The problem is that if you're a scientist, you need to come up with a hypothesis that fits the facts. And the scientific community in our country wants to say, oh, you don't have any evidence. But guess what? One, they don't investigate. They don't want to do any research. They don't want to look at the facts or data. And then they want to say, oh, there's nothing to it. So that is changing now, thanks to Dr. Avi Loeb at Harvard, who's the former chairman of the astronomy department, who's leading an effort, and others. I would also say, in terms of this issue, it's sort of an epistemological issue, right? What do we know? How do we know it? As an intelligence person, we have to reach conclusions and make decisions based on imperfect information. We don't have the luxury that academic scientists do of waiting until they have multiple sensor information that can be replicated. And in fact, there has never been a time in our history when scientists have ever tried to study a subject that is more intelligent than they are, or than we are. I think that presents a novel challenge. So ask yourself, if you took a group of people who had IQs of 80, could they design IQ tests that would discriminate amongst people that had IQs between 140 and 160? I don't know, but I think this is, from an intelligence standpoint, we have to have a different metric. And one of my beefs with some of the government personnel, the last director of this office, was he's a physicist, and that's great. I respect anybody with a PhD in physics automatically. That's amazing.
Okay.
But he tried to say, well, we don't have scientific proof, even when he was in an intelligence billet. If we did that for Chinese strategic weapons systems and Russian strategic, we'd never be able to publish anything, right? We don't have that kind of perfect information. So when it comes to national security, a different standard applies appropriately. We want the scientific information, we want the perfect, but it's just not always available. And I think when we're confronted with something like this, we have to begin to think about, well, what are the criteria by which we would conclude that some of these things must be manifestations of somebody else's technology?
Another question in the audience.
Can you describe to the audience the Brookings report and how that relates to the slowness or the pace of disclosure on these items? And I was curious, you didn't mention anything about USOs, the submersibles, and I thought that was part of the Nimitz in 2014 or some of these other ones. And I was curious if you knew Sergeant Clifford Stone.
Okay, I'll take those in reverse order if I may. I don't know Sergeant Clifford Stone. Secondly, we do have some USO information. And in fact, this government office acknowledged in their last report an incident involving a nuclear submarine. And I actually co-authored a short article about that with Navy Admiral Tim Gallaudet, who brought forward that case. The sub-community is the silent Secret Service. They really do keep things close to the vest for good reason. Obviously, their survival depends on it. So we do have incidents of that kind. They're harder to document, but there are some, and there are a lot of these objects seen entering and leaving the ocean. That's commonplace. In terms of the RAND study, if you're referring to the old study that was like back in the 60s about how the public would react, that study, yeah. So that's still something that we need to do more work on. I think it was great. I don't have any particular commentary on their conclusions, but this is something that needs more attention because Congress started asking these questions, and it was like the lawyer says, don't ask the question if you're not prepared for the answer. And so if you're saying, okay, do we actually have proof that aliens are out there? What if it comes back and the answer is yes? Are you prepared to deal with that, and how would you deal with that? And the government is not looking at that. Nobody in Congress is asking for studies on that. I'm not aware of any studies that have appeared on that topic since the RAND study. So I think it actually, at the Galileo Project, I started working on a paper with that, and then Avi, I think maybe it was too social sciencey or something, and and I don't know that we would have had a great deal to contribute, but I do think it needs to be given more attention for sure.
It might be worth adding that naval rear admiral to whom he referred, Gallaudet, said to Congress these very words, "We are not alone in the cosmos."
Yeah.
Next question.
All right, from our online audience, is there any international committee to share information? For example, if UAPs are happening to the USA and UK, surely there are also sightings in Russia, China, other countries. Just wondering if this would help us know the extent and frequency of UAP surveillance of us and our military bases.
The short answer is yes. This is a global phenomenon, absolutely, and it's documented in various ways. So for one, our forces overseas have these kinds of encounters, just as they do here. And in fact, this government office is called AERO for short, it's a long acronym, but they've produced a hotspots map where most of the UAP reports happening, and one of them, for example, is in the South China Sea. And in the Middle East is another area where there's a great deal of activity, and we do know that other countries are seeing this. The French have had a formal government office that's been, that every year for decades now, has been taking reports from the gendarmes and others, and every year they pick some of the top reports and convene a panel to investigate them. Back in the 50s, when this phenomenon was happening here and all this activity over the Capitol and so forth, they were having a similar rate of kind of reports and incidents there in Europe and in France. Very much a global phenomenon, and other militaries in different parts of the world have lots of encounters, and you can find reports of some of those in the public domain.
What is the most unusual case you've heard about?
Wow. I haven't even talked about those. I tried to stay away from, I've approached this really from my interest has been national security. And when I got into this, it was really about intrusions on our airspace and the lack of response and getting control of our airspace from a national security standpoint. But when you start to get involved in this issue, these other dimensions begin to arise. So then we start to get into orbs, we start to get into potentially abductions, we start to get into a range of things, as Lou was talking about in his book, which many people think are part of a whole package. And I guess one of my favorite cases, the Nimitz case I talked about, because it's so well documented. And what I'm trying to do is reach the mainstream, not the people that are already believers. I'm trying to help the mainstream who haven't had contact with this issue before, who likely approach it thinking this is kooky or whatever, and help them understand what our military people are saying and what they're saying. What I believe doesn't matter. What matters, of course, is what Congress and the president believe, and I think it matters what our military people are finding that they're up against, and what we need to help prepare them to deal with and our country to deal with. Which is not a very good answer to your question, I guess, but there are so many strange cases. There are some cases that involve physical damage to people. There are some cases that involve, there's some really far out stuff. I think Lou's book, Imminent, if you care to read that, you would find some really good illustrations of the more exotic side of this issue.
Got a follow-up here in the
from
back. Somewhat related to the UAP mysteries you just touched on a little bit are the purported alien abductions. And my question is, in your capacity with the intelligence community, have you or anyone you've known taken some of these abductions seriously, and what are your feelings about that possibility?
Right, so curiously, the individual who introduced me to Lou Elizondo was a former intelligence official who believes that he was abducted, he and his wife both. And so he has medical data to back that up. They were both experiencing physical symptoms. They both had, they awoke with these memories that were extremely bizarre, and they were both experiencing physical symptoms as well. And I've seen some of the related data and began to find out as I got closer to some of the research that was being done by a select few people in the intelligence community or the government and in some private groups looking at this, that there are definitely cases where certainly people have suffered physical effects from being too close to these things, radiation burns and that kind of thing. And there are accounts from people like my friend and colleague, and I know he's very sincere. There's no proof, except for he did have some physical effects, which I've seen, again, some of the data, and I'm aware that there are many other cases, and they're HIPAA protected generally. I know a physician who's treated some of these people. But frankly, I've tried to stay in my lane, kind of, and it's hard enough to get people to take the issue seriously, and it's hard enough to get the national security issue taken seriously and addressed properly. So I've kind of have better information about that, and I think I can contribute more on that. So I haven't gotten deeply into that issue, I'm afraid.
You've talked about sightings in very interesting places over Los Alamos, in the vicinity of Air Force One, in restricted airspace, military airspace, even in the home of a senior intelligence official from the Pentagon. Has anybody studied whether these might not just be random, whether there's a greater density in places that have some significance?
They have indeed. In fact, there's an organization that I support. I really like their approach, called the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. And so you have to be an engineer or scientist, with a few exceptions, to be a member of that organization, and they've done a statistical analysis on that. And one of the things that was interesting was that they found that when we first started testing nuclear weapons, not only at Los Alamos, but at other facilities, and nuclear production, like at Hanford and Oak Ridge, there were a significant number of sightings. After those facilities reached kind of a steady state, the sightings tapered off, but then when changes were introduced, when we went to multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, say, or new deployments of nuclear weapons, the sightings increased again. And it created the appearance that somebody was monitoring these facilities, and that when they detected a change, they came back to sort of get a handle on what was going on. So they found that within to be statistically, mathematically significant. Their report is online. So there is some work like that being done.
Is there time for one more question, James?
To your right, we've got one here, and you get the last word.
Hi, thank you. I find it curious that you use the words, or the words have been used, soberly concerned, versus maybe more encouraged. Because shouldn't we be more concerned about ourselves? And I guess, it seems like there's a history of UAPs making observations of us. But what about actual interference or something that could be considered nefarious on their part, or aggressive or destructive, that really deserves a feeling of a threat? What about examples of them reaching out in more of a peaceful way or beneficial way? And then, or maybe a benevolent force, if you will. And then on the other side, do you have examples of humanity exercising aggression or capturing or damaging a UAP? And then finally, any reports of UAPs in outer space?
Yeah,
Pick a couple.
I'm happy to say that we have not been seeing acts of aggression. So in this long history of interaction, there have been instances. There was a famous, for example, 1953, there was a situation in which a Navy electronic warfare aircraft, these UAP, were sort of diving on it and going right underneath it repeatedly, like an enemy fighter might. But there was no aggression. There have been a couple of fighters cases. There was a famous case or two where aircraft disappeared in close proximity to a UAP. The Frederick Valentich case in Australia, which is really bizarre because he was reporting this UFO circling overhead, and he said it's not an airplane, and he's describing it, and then there's a big metal crunching sound, and he and his plane disappeared, never to be seen again. We had a somewhat similar case over Lake Superior, I believe it was, with an Air Force fighter that merged on the radar with the UAP and was never seen again. But the larger pattern overwhelmingly is passive or permissive, nonviolent, non-aggressive, and that sort of thing. I'm not aware of any specific initiatives to contact or, do peaceful things, but you could construe some of the activities. So we have credible reports in the 70s of UAP interfering with nuclear ICBM weapon sites, appearing over the site, taking an entire squadron of ICBMs offline. So Air Force officers have testified to this. This is being investigated right now to try to find corroborating data to support what these officers have said. And some people have construed that as, hey, this is a warning. Don't think about firing those nukes. We could stop it. We could be doing you all kinds of harm if we wanted to, but we're not, and we don't want you to be shooting these things at each other either. But I'm afraid I don't have any real detail on anything that was like an overture of a peaceful nature.
Greg, you get the last word.
I insist on the last word. There have probably always been, and there will always be, people who have had a little too much moonshine, who come out and say, I just seen something that sure weren't human. But there are credible people, naval aviators and many others, scientists and researchers, who have seen things that weren't human, but weren't possible in the human realm. And that includes a man like Christopher Mellon. I'm sure glad I met you on the bike trip. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Mellon and Greg Dobbs.